Okay, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Cool. All right. Thank you for coming this morning. I know it's pretty soon after the new year, so some folks probably are still on vacation. My name is Laura McClellan, and I'm an environmental scientist in the Division of Water Quality at the State Water Board. And with me, so I'm the lead staff on this recycled water policy update. And with me presenting today will be Scott Seyfried, who's an engineering geologist in our unit. We also have Charlaphonic, Tessa Fogit, Leonardo Orego Valoe, and Claire Wagoner. So this is our team. And I just wanted to start off actually to go around the room, since there are so few of us, to have us each say our names and what organizations we're representing. And if you're listening on, we have quite a few folks listening in on the webcast. So if you're going to speak today, we ask that you use a microphone, and you'll come around with a microphone. You can raise your hand, and then we'll just make sure that folks online can hear what you're saying as well. And if you are participating remotely, you can provide your comments by emailing the email address that's on our agenda, and it'll also be showing up in a banner at the bottom part of your screen if you're participating remotely. So do you want to go around? Sure, yeah, thanks. Oh.
Good morning. I'm Mike Garabedian, here for Friends of the North Fork, an American River Group, and Placer Group of the Sierra Club.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Dave Zuber with Brown and Caldwell.
Good morning. Sam Safi with Regional SAN. It's the wastewater treatment plant in Sacramento area. We have a large recycled water project and delivery system, and we are very interested in the policy amendment updates, and also are very encouraged that State Water Board is taking huge step towards streamlining process of recycled water. Thank you.
Hi, Lauren Dempsey with the Air Force Regional Environmental Coordinator Office.
Good morning, Elizabeth Wells with El Dorado Irrigation District. We have an extensive landscape irrigation project up at EID, and we're excited to be involved in this, so thank you for inviting us.
Morning.
Hi, I'm Bobby Larson. I'm the Executive Director of the California Association of Sanitation Agencies, which is the statewide organization that represents public wastewater.
Melissa Thorn with Downey Brand, representing numerous wastewater facilities.
Tony Pizzetti, Department of Water Resources.
Steve Louie, California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
And thank you. And I forgot to mention, Amanda is our awesome help with the microphone. So holler at Amanda if you need her. And Swan Liu is going to be the person fielding our comments from online. So thank you to both of you. All right, so the purpose of this meeting today is to seek your feedback on the proposed amendment to the recycled water policy, the policy for water quality control for recycled water, which we are going to refer to as the policy for today. So it's important to note that what we're presenting today has not yet been presented to our board, to the State Water Board. So we are seeking your early feedback on this, but none of this has been approved yet. And as you'll see, we're going to run through about 13 issues or so, and some of those will have a variety of options associated with them, and some of them there will only be one option that we present, and we would like to get your input on both types. So I'll begin with some background on the recycled water policy and go over why we're doing this now. This will be a repeat for some of you. And then I'll hand it over to Scott, and he will introduce some of the items that we're considering for the proposed amendment. And then we'll be opening up the meeting for discussion as we go. So we'll kind of run through the issues quickly and then kind of go issue by issue and seek your feedback as we go, rather than waiting until the end for your comments. And then we'll also try to save some time for the end of the discussion, for the end of the meeting, for you to present any issues that you've thought of that we haven't talked about. And you can always provide your comments online by emailing Swan. And her email is swan.liu@waterboards.ca.gov. Okay, so the recycled water policy, the purpose of the recycled water policy is to promote the use of recycled water while protecting public health and the environment. And it accomplishes this by providing statewide guidance on permitting for recycled water projects. The policy was developed by stakeholders and adopted by the State Water Board in 2009. It was amended in 2013 to include monitoring requirements for constituents of emerging concern, or CECs, based on recommendations from a science advisory panel. Most recently, in 2016, the State Water Board passed a resolution directing us to reconvene the science advisory panel for CECs and recycled water and to update the recycled water policy. So there are several reasons that we're updating the policy now. Firstly, there's a requirement in the policy to reconvene the science advisory panel every 5 years, and the last panel came out with its report in 2010. Secondly, there have been changes in the regulatory environment, such as adoption of a statewide general permit for recycled water uses in 2016, and adoption of groundwater recharge regulations in 2014, to name a few. Also in 2016, the State Water Board adopted the resolution that I just mentioned, which it directed us to initiate a stakeholder process to update the policy, considering these as well as other issues. For example, they asked us to take a look at the goals and mandates for recycled water volume, the requirements for priority pollutant monitoring in the recycled water policy, as well as a time schedule for the regional water boards to review and update permits issued prior to the adoption of the 2016 water reclamation requirements. So we have two concurrent processes going on here, as you can see in this schedule. There's the recycled water policy process going on up top in blue, and then on the bottom in green, we have the Science Advisory Panel and CECs process. So the beginning of our policy amendment process, we held CEQA scoping meetings in early December. And then we have another meeting like today's stakeholder meeting next week in Fountain Valley on January 11th. And while these are going on, while we're developing the amendment to the recycled water policy, the Science Advisory Panel has been operating on a somewhat parallel timeline. So the panel convened in July and conducted a public meeting in July, and then on December 15th, they held a second public meeting to share their draft recommendations. So they will be releasing their draft report with their findings for a 30-day public comment period in mid-January or so. Once that public comment period is finished, they will finalize their report in late February, and then we will take their recommendations for consideration for the draft policy amendment, which we plan to release in late March or early April for a 45-day public comment period. So now I'm going to hand it over to Scott, who's going to discuss some of the details for the topics that we're considering for the amendment. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. My name is Scott Seifried, and I'll be introducing the topics that we want to cover and discuss this morning. Like Laura mentioned, our format is we want to introduce a topic and then stop and open up for discussion. We do want to save time at the end for any topics and comments that maybe didn't occur during the meeting. And so to save that time, it's possible we may need to cut off discussion of a particular topic. We'll try not to do that, but again, the goal is to get comments on all the topics and to have time at the end as well. So I want to start with just doing a quick flyover of the topics we want to cover and then get into it more. All these topics that you see are the same number and described in the stakeholder paper that we sent out a while back. We'll start with just an update of the constituents of emerging concern monitoring requirements, and then get into more of the topics for discussion. On the table here, we have reevaluating recycled water goals and mandates, a system for reporting and tracking recycled water use, and then we have a cluster of 5 topics that are all related to salt and nutrient management planning. And within that category, we're talking about a method and a procedure for categorizing groundwater basins, streamlined permitting criteria for non-potable reuse projects, approval processes for salt and nutrient management plans, a topic that relates to assimilative capacity and interim criteria for assimilative capacity, and then potential language regarding updating salt and nutrient management plans. So that's a lot to cover. We may, after these topics, have time for a break. We'll see what time it is. It's around 11:15 or something like that. And then there's more. We have a topic related to priority pollutant monitoring for landscape irrigation projects, as well as priority pollutant monitoring for groundwater replenishment recharge projects. Topic 6 has to do with Water Code Section 1211 and proposed language related to that. And topic 7 has to do with updating recycled water use permits, and 9 has to do with the 2009 landscape irrigation order. So my intent is to provide, say, a 2-minute or so background on each topic and then open it up. For CCC Monitoring, we have a grant agreement with the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, or SWRCB, to reconvene the Science Advisory Panel on CECs and recycled water. The panel completed its review of the current state of scientific knowledge and monitoring data related to human health and the environment and risks with exposure to CECs in recycled water, including antibiotic-resistant bacteria and antibiotic resistance genes. So this slide shows up, panel schedule shows up in a nice jet black. That's perfect. But this slide was just intended to show a more detailed view of the schedule that Laura showed earlier. There was a public meeting in Costa Mesa in July, and then a lot of you were at the meeting in December 15th here, where the panel presented preliminary findings and recommendations. SWRCB anticipates releasing the draft report from the panel this month and open up for a 30-day public comment period. Their final report is scheduled for release in February. Our role is staff will consider the recommendations in the final report and including those recommendations in the proposed amendment. And there will be opportunities for public comment on those recommendations along the way. So we understand this is a really important topic for discussion and input. At this point, the report has not been released. We have draft recommendations and findings. So this morning, we're not intending to open that up for discussion as the findings are draft and preliminary. So rather, we'd like to receive comments after the draft report from SWRCB is available. So now we'll get into the other specific topics to cover. And the first topic has to do with goals and mandates in the policy. So by way of background, the policy includes statewide goals for recycled water use. The policy also includes recycled water mandates that were derived by extending those goals by 20 years. The policy does not include guidance on a method to enforce those mandates. Also, the Department of Water Resources has established statewide water recycling targets as required by the Water Code and as published in the California Water Plan. And finally, in addition, the policy contains stormwater and conservation goals. Stormwater goals are also addressed through the Strategy to Optimize Resource Management for Stormwater, or the STORMS program, and conservation goals are also covered in the implementation of Senate bills and executive orders shown on the slide. So that's by way of background. So the options that we're putting forward for discussion, there's a couple of them, and then we'll open it up. So we're proposing to remove stormwater goals from the recycled water policy with the idea that those goals are better housed and addressed in the storms program. Similar to stormwater, we're proposing to remove conservation goals from the policy, as those goals are also more appropriately covered in the California Action Plan and through implementation of Senate bills and the executive order, specifically making conservation a California way of life. So regarding recycled water use mandates, we're proposing to remove the mandates for recycled water because there's really no clear method of enforcing the mandates. The goals that are in the policy have a similar function of encouraging continued development of recycled water. You see option B, another option we've identified is to keep the mandates, but clarify and develop tools for regional boards to make the mandates enforceable. So the bold option is what we've come to recommend, but we did identify the other option as well. So there's another couple of things to discuss about goals and mandates here before we seek some feedback and input. Regarding the goals in the policy, we have identified 5 sort of different approaches to work on this, and the first one is bolded. That's what we're proposing here is to maintain the current recycled water goals for the amendment that are in there now. Along with this recommendation is, continuing to engage members of the recycled water community to track and analyze recycled water use data. That's another topic, and to use that data and analyze it to update the goals in future policy amendments. Other options on this topic that we identified was B there, replacing the current goals with recycled water targets established by the Department of Water Resources. We could replace the existing goals with numeric goals for reducing a percentage of treated wastewater discharged to oceans and salt sinks, sort of zeroing in on that particular goal. Another option is E, removing all numeric goals and replacing them with narrative goals. So you can see A and C bolded here. With C, we do want to include, we're recommending including a narrative goal of decreasing wastewater discharges to the ocean. So with that background, I'll just pose the question to the listeners in and people here. Are there any questions or comments regarding our options and recommendations for what to do with these goals and mandates?
Thank you very much. Bobby Larson with CASA. First of all, I just want to say that we're supportive of dealing with the stormwater and the conservation in another way. I mean, that's part of why you're doing this, right? Is progress has been made since 2009, and the situation we were in then is not the situation we're in now. So I think it's perfectly appropriate and support that. I also support the recommendation to remove the mandates. Again, in 2009, there was a feeling that we really needed to push this recycling, that it wasn't happening and that people weren't doing projects. And if you look at what's happened from 2009 till now, I think you can see that that's not the case, and there's so many projects in the queue. And in addition to the point that you made, which is that they don't really make any sense in this context. And I would just like to say, too, that mandates don't really make a lot of sense when we're talking about recycled water, because mandates make sense where somebody controls everything and you can tell them go do it. In recycled water, somebody treats it, somebody purveys it, somebody's a customer, all of those things. You need markets. And so we don't think that mandates are the way to move recycled water forward. So support all of that. Then with regard to the goals, I think we really need to revisit the goals that are in the policy. Somebody told me, and I'm not good at math, but maybe you know, that they're actually like mathematically not even really very realistic. And if you take into account something that's in your paper, you know, about the changes in water use and what we expect, maybe volumetric goals of that type are not necessarily the best way. I do think we should have some goals. They're very good to kind of encourage us and move us forward, but I think they may need some reexamination. And then lastly, with regard to the item C there under the goals, we're probably okay with that as long as it's an aspirational goal that makes clear that this is something we're working toward as opposed to some sort of short-term, you know, I don't want to use the word mandate, but sort of more extortionate. I don't know what the right word is, but just so long as it's something that says this is something we want to be moving toward with all of the other things that we're doing with regard to recycled water. Thank you.
I was going to add something to make.
Can you just repeat your name?
Oh, yes, Melissa Thorn from Downey Brand. One of the things about trying to meet the goals is we have this concept now of one water and trying to treat water similarly. So if you look at the first page of your packet that was on there, recycled water is any water which, as a result of treatment of waste, is suitable for beneficial reuse. It's not limited to municipal wastewater. And we have a lot of other sources of water that could be put into the recycled water policy, and you have them listed, a lot of them on the first and second page, particularly oilfield produced water, and then wastewater from wineries and food processors. And those are being regulated now through waste discharge requirements, and it's really an inappropriate way to regulate them. If they're recycling that water, they should be regulated through the recycled water policy. And so I would urge you to expand the types of water that are covered by the recycled water policy, which will help you meet the goals of water that is being reused. For example, oilfield produced water, there's an inordinate amount of that water, and a lot of it's just being pushed back underground and then pulled back up, and it could be reused. It's a huge amount of water, and so we should be encouraging the reuse of that and not treating it as waste.
Thank you. And I just want to reiterate for folks online, you can provide your comments by emailing Swan. Swan, have we received any comments yet? Okay, thanks.
Hi, Elizabeth Wells with EID, and I also serve on the California Water Use Board, and I want to put my Water Use Board hat on real quick. I want to echo Bobby's statement about the goals. We do think that they should be looked at and just considered in this revision, so I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
Didn't mean to have you put your roller skates on there. Hi, everybody. I'm Kathy Peroni. I work with the City of San Diego Public Utilities Department. We do water and wastewater, and we are moving towards a major purified water program online in 2021. And with regard to setting goals, I certainly agree with everything that Bobby Larson said from CASA. I would also suggest with regard to, the IRWM program is a good place to maybe look at each of the regions quantifying what their particular goals are and having that roll up. And I know that's something that the California Water Plan, which is a meeting I'm attending later today, is going to be talking about, with AB 1755 being implemented for data. And so I would encourage the state board to work with DWR in its implementation of AB 1755 to look at ways to quantify what the regional water management group goals are for supply development and have that inform your policies.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Got a gentleman in the front. Did you want to speak? There's a microphone. Thank you. There you go.
Mike Garabedian. Could you explain the reason for going to, what the reason would be for going to narrative goals?
Well, I think that was brought up in the other comments that a quantitative goal may not make as much sense if it's not really well-founded on what the water's available and what the best use of the water is. I mean, there's just advantages to going narrative to describe the aspirational part of it and all that without trying to get into the calculating volumes.
And there you're talking about the goals, about the quantity.
Yes, well,
Okay.
item C there is the narrative goal to decrease discharges to the ocean, to really focus on that discharge as being something to single out as the higher, as a goal that stands different than the quantitative goals.
And what is the science for decreasing wastewater discharges into the ocean? What science backs that up?
So this is Charlaphonic, and there's two things we're looking at. As you mentioned, the current policy has numbers, so our options are what do we replace with those existing numbers. So in terms of numeric existing goals, we're looking at keeping the current numbers as we propose, but also starting a process where we get better understanding of what's really the potential for volume of recycled water, taking into account all the other factors that are important. Part of the water goes to the rivers and streams, so that's a beneficial use. Then there are cases that the water is disposed, whether it could be used. In terms of the option that we're proposing to add, in addition to having goals for total recycled water volume in the state, we believe that when you treat the water to a higher standard and then discharge it to the ocean, and then you have to spend all the infrastructure and the funding to desal that water to put it for potable reuse. We just don't think that's kind of necessarily a good strategy for the state. So we're proposing this idea, as Bobby Larson mentioned, more of an aspirational, more of an awareness that as we're treating water, if we're discharging it to the ocean, we should reevaluate whether that's a better use for that water to be actually reused and then end up eventually as a more concentrated stream in the ocean. So it's more of a policy matter. It's not a scientific. And the reason we're not putting like percent or numbers is because we don't have any scientific basis. But if you disagree with that logic that we have, we'd be more than happy as you provide the written comments to us to understand what you propose if you're opposed to that or you have other alternatives. So again, these are staff proposals that we're trying to seek input, and that's the reason we're proposing that. That should help you decide how to provide comments.
I believe you just said there is no scientific basis for decreasing wastewater discharges into the ocean. Did I understand?
We don't have any scientific numbers to come up with the numeric values of what percent of the wastewater. We don't have the numbers right now to know what percent of treated wastewater is discharged to the ocean, and potentially what percent of that is important to be discharged to the ocean and what percent of it could be reused to replace use of potable water or use of desalinated water, which in terms of impact to the environment has a bigger footprint than reusing that recycled water that's already treated.
So is there an existing process or proposal to answer the question you raise about, your question is the amount of reduced discharge that might make sense, I assume, biologically or ecologically or in terms of marine wildlife. Is there research like that going on? Not on the numbers, just on the question of stopping or reducing ocean discharges, because there is science to the contrary, including public health science.
So, as I mentioned, if there is science to the contrary at this point, we would love to know what that is, and if you could direct us to that would be great. But also, as mentioned, we are looking at initiating a research project where we would look at all these issues more systematically, looking at the numbers and doing an analysis. There's no current research, but we're proposing that as we move forward. But if there are reasons or information from anybody who is in this meeting today, if you have comments or documentation that supports that recommendation or actually opposes that recommendation, we would like to hear it, and that's the purpose of this workshop.
Well, on the science question, the only thing that comes to mind at the moment is that there research about the shorter ocean outfall pipelines, and that in that situation, public health is actually, that affects public health. But yeah, thank you.
We had another comment here, and then we probably will need to move on. We have 12 other topics to cover.
Actually, I just had a comment on something you just said. If I may just address that, it's not specific to the questions. But again, Kathy Peroni, City of San Diego's Public Utilities Department, and the statement, as I heard it, was related to the fact that you're looking at treated wastewater discharges as a way to maybe minimize the need to go to advanced purified levels because because there's a desire not to have that direction because it involves additional treatment, which I assume implies additional energy usage, and so trying to stay away from the energy usage. I would like to share with you City of San Diego's experience with that because we have owned and operated 2 tertiary treated reclamation facilities with a treatment capacity of 45 million gallons per day for going on 15 years now. And what's interesting is that from a municipal perspective, the demands for that tertiary treated water are 90% irrigation. And so even though we have the treatment capacity, what we experienced was a reduction in demands during the winter months like today. Nobody would be turning on their irrigation because it still costs money when nature was providing water or fog or whatever. So we had the treatment capacity and yet no reductions in wastewater discharges. So back in 2004, we completed an American Assembly style input process, stakeholder process, and we were able to determine that potable reuse actually was able to make greater use of our reclaimed water. It was able to actually now take that tertiary treated water and we're able to advance it, and now we're going to expand and we're going to produce 1/3 of San Diego's future water supplies from recycled water, and we're able to produce that 24/7, 365. And when we don't have demands for even that potentially that potable water, we can put it into storage in one of our existing reservoirs. So it's highly effective, highly efficient, and we are going to power phase 1 with 100% renewable energy from methane capture, either from the wastewater, which we already do, cogen, and from a landfill methane capture. So this is green at every level, so I would highly caution against the kind of bias against purification, advanced treatment purification as an effective tool because it meets all of those goals. This is a program that is highly supported by the environmental community in San Diego and elsewhere, certainly in Orange County, and I think it has, for at least municipal applications, is highly desirable.
So Scott, if I may, just for the record, I want to correct that my comment didn't intend what you stated. I was just making an observation that when you discharge the water to the ocean or to any salt sink, if later on you need to take that water and use it as a potable or for any use, then you need to go through a desalination process that has a huge footprint. I did not mean, I think what you're mentioning is a great comment because it's actually expansion of recycled water use may help us better achieve our goals that are currently in the policy in the future. So by all means, we support and we encourage that kind of approach.
If you have additional comments on this issue, I think we need to move on now, but please feel free to email Swan or email me at the end or come talk to us after. I noticed a couple of hands. Thanks.
Yeah, so I'll dig into topic 3 here, which is related to what we've been talking about, and that's tracking of recycled water use. Currently, as you know, we get our information on recycled water production and use from conducting recycled water use surveys periodically, about every 5 years or so. We found that conducting the surveys are labor intensive, time consuming, and another issue with that method is that the data come in only very periodically. And so it's not as usable as some more frequent data would be. So what we are proposing here is to include reporting requirements in permits for annual reporting of recycled water use to assist in tracking recycled water production and use, and developing a more streamlined tracking process internally using that data. So we're also considering the detail of the data to be collected. There are different ways to track and report recycled water use, and there can be a trade-off between how detailed the information is and how time-consuming and complicated it can be to get it. So we're looking at potentially including these following levels of detail, throwing them up on the screen, and inviting comment on these and others. So sort of in increasing level of detail, we definitely want to track the volume of recycled water production by a facility. And then the next level of detail would be the level of treatment that water gets. Then it gets into more detail with the volume of recycled water used by use category, obviously groundwater recharge or potable versus non-potable, but within non-potable, ag irrigation versus landscape and urban and all those categories. Another item that we'd like to track or considering for including in the system is the volume of recycled water that's potentially available for recycling, to compare that with the amount that's actually recycled and used. And lastly, topic we've just been talking about, the volume of water that would have otherwise been discharged to a salt sink. So these are some of the main categories of data that we're considering. And again, the more you include, the more work and complicated the capture system could be. And so are there other categories, or do you have any questions or comments regarding this recommendation for tracking recycled water use? Email silent.
As my last comment, it really wasn't any comment. I'm asking questions at this point entirely. What were the methods used for the? I guess it was a 2000. The last tracking, the last report.
Sure. So actually you have the mastermind of the survey in the room back here. If you want to talk to her about it afterward, I'm sure she would be happy to answer your questions. The survey was conducted on the 2015 water year, and it was done by issuing letters to all recycled water producers in the state who were directed to go to an online portal and to submit their recycled water numbers there. So they included, I think, I don't remember the number of use categories, but volume of water produced, treatment level, and then various use categories. And it was quite an effort to cross-check various volumes of recycled water produced between different agencies so that there wasn't double counting of water, and so that water was tracked through its entire life cycle, moving from different wholesalers at times. So we're looking to streamline that process to make it more efficient, to reduce redundancies in reporting that's already going on from water agencies to the regional water boards. And we're looking to streamline that by including permit language for recycled water producers to basically tell us what they're already doing. So we're at a point now of really seeking your feedback on ways that we can streamline this process. We've been discussing this a bit with Water Use California, and this is going to be an ongoing effort. So the policy amendment will be the beginning of this discussion. It'll be going on after the policy is released. The policy draft is released.
Hi, Elizabeth Wells with EID. This has, been a long time issue with tracking how much recycled water has been produced in the state, and when those surveys come across our desk, we're just like, oh gosh, another survey we have to fill out. So we actually support this for the most part, A, B, and C in particular. We would like to see some streamlined development of how do we accomplish A, B, and C? And I think that Jennifer West with Water Reuse is committed to working with you and developing some language on that. I know she's not here, but I know we're going to be working on that with you. However, though, D is a bit concerning to me. The potential volume of recycled water can be difficult to really put your finger on, and that gets into multiple of issues. For us, for instance, that could be viewed as all of the wastewater that comes into our system. However, during the winter, we don't have the demand there for recycled water. So how do you really answer that question? So that could pose some issues if we really try to develop that in the policy. So I just recommend you consider that. And so I don't know, I know Bobby had some comments too.
I just want to respond to that really quickly. We had been envisioning recycled water potential, looking at that more as a research project. We agree with you that it would be difficult to put a finger on that, and there are water rights concerns, there's infrastructure constraints, demand constraints. I think it's a much bigger question than something that each water agency would be able to answer in a survey.
And if I may add to that, I think it would be better for us to replace that in light of what Laura was clarifying. Really, our intent at this stage is all we could get is to have an understanding of the volume of wastewater. So that doesn't necessarily, as you mentioned, correlate directly to the potential, but I think in a regulatory environment and in the environment we don't currently have information about the statewide total volume of wastewater that goes through the treatment system for the different purposes. So that beginning step may be, and the previous survey, we tried to get that information as well, but it wasn't kind of compiled. Mostly it was more for a balance to know what's coming in and how much recycle to make sure the numbers are adding up, and we still need to know that an entity is treating this much wastewater and how much of it is going to recycling and how much of it is going to disposal. But we're not looking at asking you to calculate what is the potential volume of recycled water that you could achieve.
Then I think it should be stated as such that, what is the volume of wastewater coming into your facility that you treat, and not the potential volume of recycled water.
Perfect. Yes, that's why I wanted to correct that. We need to be more clear on that.
Thanks, Bobby Larson. And I just wanted to echo what Elizabeth said and just make one other point. I mean, CASA has been working with water reuse and will continue to do so as the policy moves forward, and hopefully we can have some more specific suggestions for how to go about this at a policy level. But the one point that I would want to make is that I'm not sure that the producer is necessarily the best person to answer question C. You could put this in a WDR, the MPDS, and they should know the volume produced and the level of treatment, but they may not know, because they're going through a purveyor, what volume is used by each category. So we may need to work on who reports what.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Any questions for online? All right. Okay. I think we should move on to the next.
There is actually one.
Okay.
Yeah, we got a comment through the email. This is Claire Wagoner. I'm going to read what we got. Not the whole thing, because it's a 3-page letter, but the gist of it is, it's from Andrew Demron, from the Napa Sanitation District. And the comment is essentially that they understand that the State Water Board wishes to have an efficient, streamlined statewide reporting system for recycled water, and they support this goal. However, they believe that reporting of recycled water volumes by use is not appropriate. So they are supportive of requiring electronic reporting of the total recycled water volume and level of treatment. But once you get into use categories, that's too burdensome. So that's, I think we'll post this online for those who are interested in reading the full comment.
Thank you.
So that is a good comment. And just before we move on to the next topic, I do want to mention that what we're trying to do is part of the reason we asked Water Reuse to work with the agencies. How do you do your own tracking. You know, I'm sure you generate reports as kind of reporting how you're doing within your areas. You'd have board of directors you report to. So we are hoping to understand what the current reporting and categorizing the agencies are using and trying to come meet that in the middle to serve our need as well. So we not sure that we really need to continue like the past surveys to know how much of it is going to a power plant, how much of it going to, you know, the irrigation use, or who obviously we don't want to know how all the users are. That's part of the permit and part of the district. But some level of high-level category is maybe what we're proposing is it going to direct potable? Is it going to non-direct potable? Is it being used for those type of uses to sort of help us focus our strategies? Where is it that we need to make sure that our policies are effective in promoting recycled water? So the total number is great, but I think about how you can provide us feedback with that goal of kind of giving us a little bit more information and helping move the policy as we're looking at funding and regulatory streamlining and everything. So it's really more like a tool. It's not like micromanaging what you guys do with your recycled water.
Steve Louis, California Fish and Wildlife. It might be helpful to understand or to know how much water is being diverted away from surface waters, so you can do an evaluation of environmental impacts from reduced water.
Thanks.
I was just going to suggest, and again, Kathy Peroni, and I have been working with Jennifer West also in giving some feedback already. But it may be of interest to you, rather than specific end uses, to get more of a sense of just kind of categories of end uses. I mean, in terms of, you know, for us, irrigation is just highly seasonal. So you've got a true ebbs and flows with demands for that water. So it's not like that there's a system kind of thing that we can implement to increase the demands. It's just our end user, the design with the end user is just having impact in the total amount of produced water we're going to be able to produce. So that's one kind of category, whereas other categories may be more in a constant demand kind of category, like for us, cooling towers in commercial industrial applications are going to be more steady state. So understanding your customer base from that regard is helpful too. So you know, I would encourage you to kind of probe with the data or allow more of a narrative in terms of what are the challenges for optimizing recycled water use instead of just, you know, very finite or discrete data kind of sets.
Thank you.
Okay, so we can move on to the next set of topics. So the next 5 topics actually all relate in one way or another to salt and nutrient management plans and salt and nutrient management planning, or SNMPs. So we know that you know, the SNMP provision in the policy is an important part of that policy. Many groundwater basins in California are impacted by salts and nutrients throughout the state, and recycled water can contribute to salt and nutrient loading in groundwater basins, along with many other sources, including agriculture operations, septic systems, water softeners, many other man-made and naturally occurring sources. So to address this concern, the policy provides a process for stakeholders to develop salt and nutrient management plans, which address salt and nutrient impacts on a basin-wide rather than a project-by-project basis. So since the policy was adopted in 2009, we have quite a bit of experience with the SNMPs that have been prepared, and we have received input from regions and stakeholders, and based on all that input, we have developed a set of recommendations really designed to update and improve this SNMP program. So that map does show up as something other than black. It's just for reference. It's a map of California. You can make out most of the groundwater basins. If the basin is colored in green, then that means that there has been a stakeholder group that has formed around developing SNMPs for the basin. And if it's got a red star on it, that means that basin actually has a salt and nutrient management plan associated with it that has been accepted by a regional board, just for reference. So the first of the 5 SNMP categories relates to categorization of groundwater basins. So right now, the recycled water policy states the board's intention that each groundwater basin or subbasin in California have a salt and nutrient management plan. However, we recognize that not all groundwater basins are impacted or really threatened to be impacted by salts and nutrients due to either a lack of loading or other hydrogeologic factors. So to address this, in 2009, the state board provided guidance to the regional boards to prioritize basins using the United States Geological Survey GAMMA system. That's the Groundwater Ambient Monitoring and Assessment System. So USGS went through all the groundwater basins in California, came up with a method of categorizing them, and put basins either as a high priority or a low priority with respect to water quality threat. Also, since the 2009 policy was adopted, the California Department of Water Resources developed a prioritization system known as the CASGEM system, and that is what's implemented in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So these are some background information about this topic. Finally, some of the regions took a closer look at their region and came up with their own individual prioritization system for groundwater basins as to which ones to focus on for salt and nutrient management plan development. So to address this issue, the staff is proposing to require regional water boards to evaluate their groundwater basins with respect to water quality threats from salts and nutrients, and based on that assessment, develop a list of basins that will need an SNMP. The policy would include language listing characteristics to consider in this assessment, and the amendment language would include a requirement to include periodic reassessment of this categorization. The other option that we looked at for this issue is to require that the regions fully implement and use the USGS GAMMA system or the CASGEM system. Use of these systems would provide for a more uniform treatment of groundwater basins in California. And the CASGEM system, since it's used by Sigma, would have that advantage of tying into that other program. In any of these systems, the intent here is to encourage regions to focus SNMP efforts towards those basins that are most at risk with respect to salt and nutrients, and to provide regional board staff with permitting guidance for recycled water projects. It could be used by regional boards to determine when an SNMP may be required as a condition of the permit. So with that background and introduction, are there any questions or comments about this proposal for basin characterization? Oh, sorry. That might help. This is, yeah. Good point. So yeah, in bold is what we're proposing here, and then the B is another option that we looked at.
Kathy Peroni. I do support the approach. I just would ask that you characterize not just as a threat, but it's also a potential benefit in the case of purification. We in the San Diego region, again, have highly saline water from the Colorado River. After we take the recycled water and put it through advanced treatment purification processes, the salinity is actually brought down to about 15 parts. The TDS is about 15 parts per million. So believe it or not, and that's coming down from about 700. So it actually, once that is blended with our imported water supplies in our reservoir, it'll have the effect of highly diluting the salts in our drinking water supply. And as that water is applied to the basin, it is improved water quality. So it is not just a threat. To the extent that purification is included under the category of recycled
use is
water.
not just a threat. If it's been
Gone through
reverse
advanced
osmosis, then
purification.
it actually
yeah.
can improve conditions.
Yeah.
So just a clarification, and forgive me if I'm jumping ahead. So, for instance, with the Central Valley Basin, we are kind of in a sub-basin up in the foothills. We really don't have a groundwater basin. So there might be areas within the Central Valley that are considered impacted and areas that are not. So are sub-basins considered in this basin categorization that you're trying to identify here?
Yeah, and that would be up to the region to how they wanted to handle that. But if they felt there were sub-basins that were distinct from the more regional basin that should be called out as either high or, a high threat category or low, then that would be up to the region. That's what we're thinking now.
Okay, and then would you have the recycled water purveyor producer develop those salt and nutrient management plans still, or would that be under the direction of the staff at the regional board? Who's taking the responsibility for developing the salt and nutrient management plans is my question.
Well, at this juncture, that aspect actually wouldn't change. So it still would be the stakeholder collaborative process.
Okay.
It's just intended to focus that effort on key remaining basins and distinguish those that maybe you're referring to that might not need that effort.
Okay, and then I also, and maybe this doesn't need to be pointed out, but I just want to make sure, when we were involved in the original policy discussion back in '09, and I think Bobby can remember this too, there was some discussion about those subbasins and those little agencies that would be developing their small, recycled water programs and such, and we didn't want to put this huge salt nutrient management plan stakeholder process on the backs of those small agencies. So I think that's really important to make sure that we continue with that, because that's a huge financial burden that can be imposed on the agency. So I just want to make sure that you realize that the original intention was, yeah, you might need to do one, but it should just be specific to your sub-basin and not this huge stakeholder effort for a larger area.
I think we agree with that comment. The policy as written, it actually is not very clear on that intent. So we propose to clarify that intent for the exact same reason that you mentioned, because the policy calls for salt and nutrient management plans for all basins and sub-basins. And even though, afterwards our executive director issued a letter clarifying the regions to focus on the basins and sub-basins that have been impacted or are a high threat. So the policy language is not consistent with the intent you described. So we're proposing to clarify the intent to be consistent to what you suggested.
Comments online? Okay.
Hi, questions. Are we aware, or is there awareness of the extent to which existing basin plans of this nature anticipated recycled water in them? So that's my first question.
I'm not sure I understand the question, to be
Well,
honest.
let me ask the additional question would be, do you contemplate any assessment as this process goes on, assuming you adopted this process for topic 4.1, of the basin plan consideration of having recycled water added to its discharges into groundwater and so forth?
Well, yeah, I mean, that is sort of the heart of the SNMP, that if if you're intending to use recycled water for irrigation or groundwater recharge, then the SNMP is a study that puts that use in context to the whole salt budget of the basin and assesses what that might mean for that salt budget. So, I mean, that is the sort of the heart of it, is your question. So that's what the SNMPs are for, basically.
Right, I'm sure. So I would assume that, yeah, the answer to my question is yes for basins that have groundwater replenishment with wastewater, treated wastewater. Okay, thanks.
Comments or questions? Okay, let's move on to 4.2.
Okay. So this topic has to do with streamlined permitting criteria for non-potable recycled water projects. So I'm going to provide a little background here for a couple of minutes. The policy currently contains streamlined permitting criteria and guidance for anti-degradation evaluations, but only limited to landscape irrigation projects and under the assumption that there's an SNMP in place or in development. The policy does not include streamlined criteria or anti-degradation guidance for other non-potable recycled water use projects. For example, use of recycled water for agriculture irrigation or other non-potable uses allowed in Title 22. Also, the policy currently is silent in regards to permitting projects in basins that do not have an SNMP or where an SNMP is being developed. So the assumption was that every groundwater basin and subbasin would either have an SNMP or there would be one in development. And so it's silent on permitting projects when that's not the case. Also, more background, since the policy was adopted, the State Water Board developed a statewide water reclamation requirements for recycled water. That's known as the 2016 WRRs, which provides streamlined criteria and an anti-degradation analysis for all non-potable recycled water projects. The way this criteria works, it was developed such that if a regional water board determines that a non-potable project conforms to the requirements in the 2016 WRRs and enrolls that applicant in the order, then no further anti-degradation analysis is needed for the project. And even in that case, the regional board has discretion and may require the project applicant to develop or participate in developing an SNMP. So staff is considering amending the policy to include streamlined permitting criteria for projects using recycled water for all non-potable uses allowed under 22. So expanding it from current landscaping to all the non-potable uses. Like the 2016 WRRs, the criteria would be written such that no further anti-degradation analysis would be required for non-potable projects that meet the criteria in the policy. The criteria would be based on the criteria that were developed for the 2016 WRRs, such that the criteria would be as protective as those in the order, in the 2016 WRRs. So the rationale here is the streamlined criteria could be used to facilitate permitting of non-potable recycled water projects that meet the criteria and for which the 2016 WRRs are not an appropriate permitting mechanism. And they could be applied in basins where there is no SNMP in place or in development. So that's the background that we wanted to provide. It's also written up in the stakeholder paper, but we could ask at this point, are there any questions or comments regarding this proposal to include streamlined permit criteria in the policy for non-potable projects?
Aside from being open-ended, this sounds like an open-ended, it sounds like there would be no end or no way to change once it's implemented. I mean, this is permanent streamlining for a particular.
So this would add language to the policy that would kind of put a box around types of projects that could be permitted without further anti-degradation analysis. So it wouldn't be issuing a permit, it wouldn't be any kind of permitting action, but this guidance could be used by the regional board to issue permits or to refer to when they are issuing a permit for non-potable recycled water projects that meet those criteria that would be listed in the policy. So we'd basically be taking what's in the 2016 water reclamation requirements, so criteria such as application at agronomic rates, compliance with Title 22, following good nutrient management practices. If you meet those criteria, then no further anti-degradation analysis would be required in permitting your project. So when the regional board is issuing a permit for that specific project.
Do these permits, do the permits come up for renewal where there could be reconsideration of that, or is there some kind of, and how long is that period? And could information be turned up in the meantime that would say that there needs to be a change?
Yeah, so the policy would include language similar to the 2016 water reclamation requirements that would allow the regional board to make a finding of that there are unusual circumstances in the basin or in the specific project that would make the project not able to follow these streamlined permitting criteria. So the regional board can make that determination. It's not holding the regional board to issue a permit a certain way. They always have discretion over how they permit projects. And to answer your other question, waste discharge requirements, water reclamation requirements do come up for renewal periodically. That's at the discretion of the regional board. Got a question over there in the back.
Thanks, Bobby Larson. I overall support what you're recommending. It seems to make sense to apply this streamlined criteria under the conditions that you articulated. The only concern that I want to express about this, and it kind of goes back to the original intent of the SNMPs when the recycled water policy was developed, and it was that all stakeholders, all the sources of salinity in a basin would be convened to address these issues. It was recognized at that time, and I think still is that recycled water is not necessarily the driver for this basin degradation. They just happen to be the people queuing up for a permit. And so my concern is about the language that says that as a condition of the permit, where it's a high impacted basin, the regional board could require development of or participation in one of these plans. I understand why it's important that this process be underway, and probably by now it already should have been under the old policy. So I see what you're trying to get at. On the other hand, I would be concerned if a single recycled water project was told it's your job to do a SNMP for this impacted basin, or you can't water your grass. So I think we should think about how that's worded and if there are any constraints that might be put around that requirement.
Thank you.
Good morning, Debbie Webster, Central Valley Clean Water Association, and I appreciate the opportunity to give some comments on this. In the Central Valley, we've been in a 10-plus year process developing our SNMP, and we have multiple groundwater basins, but teeing off on what Elizabeth said, we do have areas where there is no basin. So having recognition that this would cover also that those are typically non-priority basis, they're typically case by case. So there's not these SNNP big stakeholder, like there's a general coverage, but you might not have a plan for a basin because you don't have a basin. So really important to recognize in this. But I would also say, kind of teeing off last subject and this subject, is that, and just what Bobby said, is that in the Central Valley, the SNMPs are really not driven by recycled water projects. And quite honestly, most of our stakeholders in that process are quite confused that the recycled water policy is driving a lot of our work and what requirements are there. And so going back, as we go through these topics, going back and looking at it and saying, yeah, we moved stormwater out of this process, there's going to be places where SNMP and SNMP requirements really are not appropriate for the recycled water policy because of these greater stakeholder processes, and we need more than water recyclers in the room for those discussions.
Thanks. Do we have any questions online?
Laura, I want to just kind of get feedback based on the comments in here, if I may. Yeah. So we all kind of know, those of us who've been with Recycle Water program in different capacities for a while, that part of the reason this discussion of SNMP, even though we agree it's a broader thing and many sources of salts that contribute, is in the policy, was as a way of trying to figure out how you can have streamlined permitting, where you look at a basin or sub-basin, look at all the contributions of salts and nutrients, where recycled water may be one of them, and one of the minor ones in some cases, and some ones could be huge salt loading, is to look at it and make an evaluation, do an analysis on the impact on the basin, and then once that analysis is done, then you're eligible for a streamlined permitting. So the thought process in here, which I like to get input is that currently even the general order that we talked about has a requirement that either they are participating in an SNMP or they are in a basin that have an SNMP to be eligible for that permit, or they could do a nutrient management plan for their specific project. So we're proposing to clarify that because, for example, in the basins where we say the salt and nutrient management plans are not needed, then you can meet that criteria. So you're really doing a project-specific evaluation or analysis within the policy to say that if you apply recycled water at these rates, then you're still eligible for streamlined permitting. So it's clarification of that. But ultimately, we need to recognize that there are cases that if not, they're not able or the group is not doing SNMP, the efforts are not happening, the basin is a threatened by salts and nutrients, then the project needs to be evaluated as a project-specific waste discharge requirement. And under those scenarios, they're not doing SNMP, that's an option, but they're doing an analysis, an anti-dig analysis to make an evaluation why their project is not going to adversely impact the project. So we're not kind of intending to put everybody in this tube, is that if you go in this path, if you're in a basin that has an impact, then these are options for you to be part of a streamlined permitting. But if you don't fit in this or there's no efforts, like for maybe in Region 3, if that's not the case, then recognize that you may have to do an evaluation specifically for your project in order to be able to do the permit. And I think that was the intent of the original policy, to minimize the number of cases where each recycled water project had to be evaluated on a project-specific basis. So I'm sure I'm not very clear, but that's kind of a thought process that goes to our mind. What do you do when you're in a basin that salt and nutrients are an issue? What do you do in a basin which they're not a threat? You have a pristine basin and you don't have recycled water that you think is going to contribute to it as much if you're applying it at agronomic rate. And how to have a streamlined permitting for those, and which categories, the small categories, may need a project-specific evaluation of impacts to the basin and the groundwater. Not the basin, I mean to the project area. So as you're reviewing, our thoughts and going back to think about it, if you have any thoughts about that, that is sort of what we're trying to figure out what the different bins are. As Scott mentioned, currently the policy assumes every basin or sub-basin is going to be in the process of SNMP. And we know that's not happening, and that may not be needed in all the basins and sub-basins.
Okay. So the next topic, we're still in the world of SNMPs here. The next topic has to do with providing clarification regarding the process for how regional boards accept salt and nutrient management plans. As it is now, the policy states that regional boards shall consider for adoption of SNMPs as a basin plan amendment, quote, for those groundwater basins within their regions where water quality objectives for salts or nutrients are being or are threatened to be exceeded. That's the current policy language. What we've seen, however, is many SNMPs have been prepared following the guidelines in the policy, and those SNMPs conclude that water quality objectives are not exceeded or threatened to be exceeded, even with the proposed recycled water projects. The policy is effectively silent in regards to the approval process for these SNMPs. and or how those SNMPs are to be used by water boards going forward. So our proposal is to include language in the policy just to explain the process for regional boards to accept SNMPs that do not involve an amendment to the basin plan. The language will include a more formal process for describing staff review and approval of SNMPs, and how approved SNMPs are to be used to guide permitting of recycling water projects in the region. So do we have any questions or comments on this topic at this time?
So just to provide a little more background, this is basically making explicit what has been happening, which is that not all SNMPs need a basin plan amendment, and a lot of the regions aren't sure of how to accept those SNMPs if there is no basin plan amendment. So we would be making explicit what is the status quo today.
Good summary. Okay. We have two more SNMP topics to cover here. The next has to do with assimilative capacity. Assimilative capacity refers to the ability of a water body to receive, in this case, salts and nutrients without exceeding water quality objectives. This topic has to do with how a project proponent can use the assessment of assimilative capacity to demonstrate compliance with the state's anti-degradation policy, also known as Resolution 6816. Right now, the policy includes interim assimilative capacity criteria for cases where either an SNMP is being prepared, in the case of landscape irrigation projects, or until such time as an SNMP is in effect for groundwater projects. In these cases, as it is now, the interim criteria state that compliance with Resolution 6816 can be achieved by demonstrating that the individual project utilizes less than 10% of the available assimilative capacity in a basin, or that multiple projects would use less than 20% of the available assimilative capacity. These interim criteria were intended to assist with permitting of recycled water projects while SNMPs were being developed, again with the assumption that every basin was going to have an SNMP either being developed or in process. At this time, the deadlines for SNMP development in the policy have passed, and there's a need to clarify for how these interim criteria are to be used going forward. So we developed a few options to look at to address this issue. The first is to go ahead and just extend the interim assimilative capacity for potable and non-potable projects for the same reason that they were included in the first place. The second kind of obvious option is to not extend this 10 and 20% interim rule, as the deadline for SNMPs has long passed. And what we've come up with is option C, and that is to extend this interim capacity criteria, but only for groundwater replenishment, for groundwater recharge projects. Rationale is this would continue to encourage development of SNMPs in those basins that use recycled water for groundwater replenishment, and also continue to facilitate permitting of those projects. It's also recognizing that groundwater recharge projects can represent a larger part of the salt nutrient management, salt nutrient budget of a basin. So do we have any questions or comments regarding our proposal for extending the use of this interim capacity criteria for groundwater recharge projects?
A question or two. So what has the experience been, if any, under the interim policy? And does the dropping of potable and non-potable, what is the reason? Is it assumed that that wouldn't affect salts and so forth?
So the interim assimilative capacity, as written in the policy right now, were to be used only where salt and nutrient management plans were in development or while they were being prepared. And this was as a means to help projects get permitted while they were working on an SNMP. So before the SNMP has been accepted or adopted by the regional board, how do you permit a project as it comes along the pipe? And so the policy provided guidance on how to permit those projects while SNMPs were in development. However, the deadlines for SNMP development have passed, and we recognize that these interim criteria may be appropriate for certain applications of recycled water, like groundwater recharge. So we're proposing to extend the use of that interim 10 or 20% rule for groundwater recharge projects that are currently developing an SNMP. So where the regional board has said, yes, you are developing an SNMP, you may use these 10 or 20% interim assimilative capacity. And then for other projects, they would either fit under that streamlined permitting criteria that we described earlier, or they would be permitted based on an accepted SNMP, or they would be permitted on a project-by-project basis.
Since you're looking at potable and non-potable projects, would it make sense to also extend the use of interim capacity for surface water augmentation potable reuse projects as well?
So the policy, currently, we're not proposing to have the policy cover surface water augmentation because those regulations are still draft. They haven't been adopted by the State Water Board. So depending on the timing of how this policy amendment moves forward, the draft policy is expected to be released in late March, early April. Then we'll have some time for public workshops, public hearings. During that time, it's possible that the draft regulations for surface water augmentation may be adopted by the board. I'm not sure what their timeline is. So we'll look at that as we go along and see if it's appropriate to include that kind of language in here.
But you do have the option of maybe adding it conditional upon that approval.
I guess let me ask for clarification, because when you're talking about surface water augmentation project, what we're looking at with this whole assimilative capacity and anti-dig analysis is impact to groundwater. So if you're doing surface water augmentation, if any way that triggers the NPDES permit that has other requirements. So right. I'm not sure when you say address it within this one in terms of groundwater impact, unless they discharge in brine to land, there's really not a direct link. So
I was just trying to be inclusive of all potential potable reuse projects, since it is you've got a potable and a non-potable category.
Yeah, but I think maybe we can add clarification in terms of when we're talking about those projects, we're talking about the ones that have impact to groundwater, because the surface water augmentation, if you're taking treated recycled water and you're putting it in a reservoir, then you're not actually putting it having an impact on groundwater basin.
Well, you are, in terms of it's melding with the other supplies, and it becomes part of the the drinking water system, which does apply to irrigation. So but it should be entirely beneficial. Yeah. But which would be the case for potable reuse with groundwater recharge as well. So I think the same logic applies.
Well, we will look into this and talk to Division of Drinking Water, but I think it's a little bit kind of probably outside the scope of the current policy, but we will certainly take a look at that comment and see if it's feasible.
Bobby Larson, sorry, I don't mean to disagree with you, Kathy, but I think that it's very important that this policy stick to groundwater, stick to matters 100% within the Water Board's jurisdiction, and not bring in anti-degradation under the Clean Water Act and all those other things that come with that. I know those things may need to be dealt with in some way, but I think you have your hands full with this, and so I would say let's not expand this policy to address surface water assimilative capacity issues.
This is Debbie Webster. More of a question. And during the recycle water policy and why we were working on our salt and nitrate management plan in the Central Valley, we had this question. Is originally, I know this was set up for the SNMPs, but if you have a project that's coming along afterwards, it's not listed in the basin plan, it's not there, but you want to propose a project. The question that we've asked is, does that mean that you now have to modify the SNMP to include that recycled water project? Because if that's the case, and I really would strongly advocate that if we want to promote recycled water in the Central Valley or in California, that we wouldn't necessarily require that at this point. But and I'll explain that in a second. But if that's the case, then this needs to go beyond groundwater recharge, if that's the intention where you're going. But I would say that where I'm taking this step further is I would, and again, I'm coming from a Central Valley perspective where recycled water, the salt from recycled water is a very small component of the overall salt load in the Central Valley. And having it so that we would have to wait 5 or 10 years for a process for a salt and nitrate management plan to change in order to get a recycled water project, which might be very small, put in place, would be a huge disincentive for recycled water projects. So I would say at least keep that interim if you're requiring a change to be in there. Otherwise, just make it very clear that that we're not talking about that every recycled water project needs to be part of that SNMP. There's just showing that it's consistent with it.
Yeah, and just to respond, that's the current language in the policy, and it's in the current language in the streamlined criteria, just that the project is consistent, and that doesn't, maybe that needs to be clarified, but the intention is that doesn't mean that your specific project is listed and embedded in the SNMP.
Caveat I may add to that, I know that question has come up within the context of salt and nutrient management efforts with the Central Valley. But the policy, as Scott mentioned, we're basically going to say if you have a salt and nutrient management plan in place, then you permit the project and you apply the project consistent with that. But if the salt and nutrient management planning itself has additional requirements, then that's not something that I think we're going to try to get into within the policy discussion or within this group. But thanks for pointing that out.
Okay, so we have no.
Yeah, so we'll post the slides on our website, the Recycled Water Policy webpage, after today's meeting. And there's also everything that's in the slides is also in our informational document, which is already up on the Recycled Water webpage. And we also have another workshop on January 11th in Fountain Valley. That one will not be webcast, but feel free to attend both if you feel like it.
So we have one more topic related to salt and nutrient management plans, and that has to do with a process for updating SNMPs. The policy states now that stakeholders are to provide monitoring data collected from SNMPs every 3 years to the regional boards, but is silent with regards to a process for what is to be done with that data, or if or how SNMPs are to be updated. A lot of SNMPs include conceptual models that model and predict water quality over 10 to 20 years, and yet there's no available guidance for stakeholders or regional boards what to do to check those models against the data that come in. So staff is proposing to include language in the policy to encourage stakeholders to update SNMPs periodically. including the types of analysis that should be completed in these updates and the frequency that these updates should be completed. So it's language of encouragement, and it's also guidance on what should be included in the updates to keep these SNMPs more of an evergreen process than a one and done report. That's a pretty small, pretty fast introduction, but are there any comments or questions regarding this proposal?
Anything online? Okay.
Is there anybody besides me that wants to take a 5-minute break? Or, okay.
No, I think that means people are ready for
Okay, yeah, we can.
Okay.
All right, let's.
So we'll come back at 10:45. Thanks.
Welcome back, everybody. We'd like to continue the meeting at this time. We have, 4 or 5 more topics to cover. The next 2 topics have to do with current provisions in the policy requiring priority pollutant monitoring. So the first has to do with a provision regarding priority pollutant monitoring for landscape irrigation projects. Right now, the recycled water policy requires priority pollutant monitoring for recycled water used for landscape irrigation. This requirement was put in place due to concerns regarding potential contamination from incidental runoff to surface waters from concerns like broken sprinkler heads or poorly aimed sprinklers, that type of thing. Based on our review of monitoring data, it indicates that detections of priority pollutants in tertiary treated water used for landscape irrigation is infrequent. We also note that priority pollutant monitoring is required for NPDES permits. So based on our review of the data, you can see in bold, we have recommended considering removing priority pollutant monitoring as a requirement for landscape irrigation projects. We, as you can see, other options we've developed, including just reducing the required frequency or reducing the number of constituents off the priority pollutant list. And of course, an option just to maintain the requirement. But again, based on our look at things and the data, we developed our recommendation to actually remove the requirement from the policy. So that's a short and sweet background and explanation. Are there any questions or comments related to that recommendation?
Can you turn on the mic?
So the webcast cut out. So the question is the guidance updating at the SNMPs.
So we'll post the presentation online at the end of today, and if the commenter wants to send me an email with their question, if they want clarification or if they just want to give me a call.
The question is, did the staff consider making periodic updates, say every 5 years, mandatory? And if so, why has the option not been recommended?
So they're actually, the SNMPs are not mandatory themselves in the policy, so it would be strange to require mandatory updates for something that isn't mandatory in the first place, the way that it's written. So that was our logic for not requiring mandatory updates. Also, we believe that that is most appropriately addressed by each regional board. Each regional board has discretion to look at conditions in that specific basin, see whether an update is appropriate, and then talk with the stakeholder group that is appropriate for that SNMP.
According to page 11, this decision is based maybe all or in part on the data from the last 5 years. Is that data available?
Yeah, that data is publicly available from CWIX, the California Integrated Water Quality System. And we also will include that data analysis in our staff report when we release the policy for draft comment period in March.
What is the name that you'd use to find it on that system?
CIWQS, I believe.
But the name on that system to find this particular data?
It would be, we've had to do a bit of a data dive ourselves to find that data, so it would be a little bit challenging to pull it out, but it's...
Most things.
Yeah.
Well, we can share that data once we have kind of been able to tabulate it when it's available. And also, as Laura mentioned, when we release the public draft as part of the staff report. That information and analysis will be included.
And how is this monitoring data assembled? Because I know there's been active concern by Brenda Abelman and Russian River Watershed about landscape irrigation water going on when it's not supposed to, or leaking, et cetera, and it's not necessarily being identified as a problem.
So waste discharge requirements have data for priority pollutant monitoring. If that waste discharge requirement was issued after the policy was adopted in 2009, we have that data. We have been looking at primarily at NPDES data because that is most readily available. So that's for recycled water that comes from an NPDES permit. We have priority pollutant data for that. So we've been making our determinations based on primarily the NPDES data set.
And I think the other thing I may add is that, within Title 22, the runoff of the discharge from the facility and incidental runoff is basically, they can't have just the water go to a water body, otherwise they'd be subject to other permitting requirements. So, and where they actually testing is not at the end, it's basically before they use the water for recycling, for using landscape irrigation, that testing is being done. So where is that? That's where that information is coming from, the reporting requirements that currently is in our recycled water orders, as well as the WDRs that Laura mentioned. So to the extent that information is available, we will look at it. But in terms of the potential impact and the runoff to the water bodies, many of these facilities are not even close to the water bodies. If they're going into a storm drain, there's other requirements. It just seems like a duplicative requirement, and you don't have similar requirements if you're actually irrigating with regular water, because that's where the concern is that you may be picking up pesticides and other things that may be runoff. So the runoff under Title 22 is not a permitted activity. So you don't want to penalize everybody for somebody who may be violating the terms of the permit and the Title 22 requirements.
Is there a determination that there aren't anything other than the priority pollutants that might need to be monitored for?
Currently, the policy is only talking about priority pollutant monitoring, as Laura mentioned. At the production facility, there is requirements for monitoring, so those requirements are in place. But what this was doing is that as a producer, you say, oh, if I'm going to use my water down the stream when I'm not disposing to land, because those are really the only facilities that were not doing the permit. If you were currently discharging to land, and then periodically you want to use that water for landscape irrigation, then you had to do this additional testing. And that additional testing, it does not seem relevant to the scope of the project and the potential impact from that recycled water being used for irrigation.
So could this include school yard lawns or sports lawns and that kind of thing?
That's what we're proposing. The proposal, again, I should say, this is not a decision. These are listening sessions. So this is a staff recommendation that we eliminate the requirement for priority pollutant targeted at landscape irrigation projects altogether. Because we don't, based on the data and based on the intended, what the intent is, we don't think that priority pollutant is we can justify it as an ongoing process.
A final question. Is there any testing in this category for antibiotic resistant or antibiotic genetic material?
CCCC monitoring you're talking about?
So antibiotic resistant bacteria and antibiotic resistance genes are not considered priority pollutants, so they would not be considered under this category of priority pollutant monitoring. We did ask the Science Advisory Panel on CECs to look at antibiotic-resistant bacteria and antibiotic resistance genes to determine what, if any, monitoring they recommend for that in recycled water. So we're waiting along with you to see what their recommendations are in their draft report, and I would advise you to comment on that if you have comments during their public comment period starting in mid-January. Thanks.
Yeah, but to also clarify, the current policy has requirement for CEC monitoring that includes the compounds you mentioned for groundwater recharge projects. But currently, there's no requirement in the policy or any of the permits that the regions have issued for CEC monitoring for other irrigation type of projects. So we basically, for that one, unless, as Laura mentioned, we find otherwise from the panel analysis, we're not recommending to expand the scope of CEC monitoring to other projects other than the groundwater recharge projects. So we're proposing to maintain status quo on that. So the focus on this one was just priority pollutant specifically.
Okay. So our next topic also relates to priority pollutant monitoring. Currently, the policy includes a requirement that groundwater recharge projects conduct priority pollutant monitoring 2 times a year. Since the policy was adopted, Title 22 regulations for groundwater replenishment were adopted, and those regulations require more frequent priority pollutant monitoring, that is quarterly, for a minimum of 2 years, and then in accordance with Title 22, after that 2-year period, the project proponent can approach the Water Board for a minimum of annual priority pollutant monitoring. So this is kind of just a policy cleanup item to just remove the language for priority pollutant monitoring from the policy and rely and keep all that in one place in Title 22. So it's more just policy cleanup kind of an issue than changing monitoring requirements. Are there any questions or comments about that proposal? Okay, so we have 3 more topics we'd like to cover. Topic 6 here has to do with clarifying the process for recycled water projects to comply with Water Code Section 1211, which requires wastewater treatment plants to obtain approval from the State Water Board prior to making any change in the point of discharge, place of use, or purpose of use of treated wastewater. A recycled water project proponent needs to verify their compliance with the agencies involved in this that they are working with to get permits or to receive funding or loans. So what we're talking about is also known as wastewater change petitions. This approval is required for many recycled water projects, and we have heard from a number of stakeholders that they have concerns about the mechanism for verifying compliance with Water Code Section 1211 in this process. So to address that concern, the proposal is simply to include language in the policy to clarify the requirement and the process for complying with Water Code Section 1211, and to ensure effective intra and interagency coordination with wastewater change petitions. Another issue that may be addressed in this proposed amendment is that it might be added, language may be added that states that the State Water Board may consider cumulative impacts of multiple projects occurring in a given water body as part of this process. So we don't have the language in front of you, but the proposal is to develop that language to address this topic. And we're interested in any questions, comments, or input you might have on this topic at this time too.
Thanks, Bobby Larson. I just want to say that I think that this is one of the most important issues facing our recycled water projects today is the Section 1211, and so I think it's important that it be addressed in the policy. I think if you really want to address it in a way that is answering the multiple questions that are out there and that really helps people understand what they need to do when, I'm not sure you can meet your deadline. It's very, very complex. We've had some conversations with the water rights staff and with some board members about this following the workshop that you all had at the state board back in November, I think it was, on the LA River. So I think it is critical that we get some clarity on this, and I'm glad that you guys want to take a stab at it. I just want to caution that I think it's going to be difficult because there are so many different situations. So maybe one thing to look at in 1211 is some sort of tiering, right? If you're the only discharger to a water course, maybe there's one approach. If there are multiple dischargers, you may need some sort of, group planning for the future that can be assessed and you can all move on. There may be situations where it's almost like a ministerial thing where you're discharging into a tiny stretch of technically fresh water that goes right to a bay or right to so I think, I guess what I'm saying is we want to work with you on this. We think it is really important. I also think that it's good that someone from Fish and Wildlife is here because we understand that there's a big lack of clarity there in terms of how to deal with Fish and Wildlife's concerns in addition to the water boards. And so somehow getting that interagency process in place so that everybody understands the rules, the timing, et cetera, is very, very important. And I know that's not very helpful. I know what a lot of the problems are. I'm not sure I know what a lot of the solutions are, but I think if we all kind of put our heads together, hopefully we can make some progress.
Yeah, thank you. Those are very helpful comments. We'll definitely be following up with you. We will not be going beyond what is in the statute for what our statutory authority is. So currently we're not proposing to add a ton of explanatory clarity in the way that you were describing in the policy itself. But I think that would be something that would be appropriate for the staff report and also for further discussion with Fish and Wildlife and with the Division of Water Rights. Amanda, we have one more question up in the front.
Thanks. Can you explain what you mean by not going beyond your authority? That is a good question. So this is a policy for water quality control for recycled water, and policies must comply with all the laws that are out there, everything that's in the statute. We can't disobey laws. So we are not proposing to go beyond what is in the water code for Water Code Section 1211, which should be self-evident.
Yeah, I think to clarify is that the state board policy and regulation, what we're looking at is that there's a current process that water right implements in looking at compliance of Section 1211 for recycled water project. So when we had our initial kind of smaller listening sessions, there was comments that many times project proponents are not aware of these requirements, and they were concerned that the regional boards may be permitting recycled water projects without making sure that they are actually have gone through this process if it's appropriate. So the purpose of this is really part of the same language we currently have in the statewide order, is to draw attention to this Section 1211 requirement and state that the projects need to be in compliance with the provisions of that section. We are not intending as part of the policy to revamp and kind of look at the scenarios that Bobby Larson was mentioning, is that are there circumstances under which this the petition change of use location may be required, they may not be required. So that's what the difference is, that we're not proposing to go beyond existing statutory and regulatory authorities under which the water rights is currently operating.
But wouldn't the CEQA process take you on beyond 1211?
No, I'm not sure. I guess once we review the CEQA comments, we'll see what we have. But definitely we would have to look at it.
Okay. The next topic 7 of 8 here, is more of an action item. It has to do with updating recycled water permits. So the background is many regional water boards have historically permitted recycled water projects under site-specific waste discharge requirements, water reclamation requirements, or master reclamation permits. Because these types of permits and orders are not frequently updated, some water facilities have permit requirements that potentially may not be consistent with the requirements in Title 22 or other requirements in the recycled water policy. So this topic is just, the staff is proposing to require regional boards to review existing permits and update as necessary for compliance with existing regulation. I don't know how much comment we might have on that, but I'll just open it up if there's any comments or reaction to that. And okay.
It's come from Raymond J. How would this be implemented to help streamline permitting of RW projects?
I can tackle that. You know, first of all, Laura mentioned the resolution that was adopted by the board last year, November, December 2016. So by that resolution, the board required us to have the regional boards go look at the permits that were issued prior to 2009 and now probably prior to this update. And the purpose of it was to make sure the requirements are consistent with the policies and regulations that have been put in place since then. But there was also the drive to look at those and make a determination if it's more appropriate and if it's eligible to enroll those projects under the statewide general order. So part of the response to that streamlining would be that we're hoping that many of those projects may meet the criteria to be enrolled under the statewide order, or may meet the streamlined criteria within the policy that they could have permits that are consistent with that. So that's really the only part of the response to that.
So I have a client that was trying to get under the WRRs, and the regional board, Melissa Thorn. Yeah, sorry. Was trying to get under the WRRs, and the regional board wouldn't allow it because they have an MPDS permit that allows them to sometimes have secondary treatment because they have an ocean outfall. So, but when they're recycling, they're always using the tertiary. And the thought is that the Title 22 engineering report was what you use for justification for coming under the WRRs. But the regional board was saying you have to have a WDR because we have to have some method to require you to only put tertiary water out, even though recycling, presumably you can put secondary out depending on what your uses are. So we need to address that you don't need another WDR to address the treatment part of it if you have an MPDS permit or some other thing that covers the treatment plant. So we're running into these kind of stumbling blocks. And also where people have WDRs, we've seen the regional boards want to keep them as WDRs, even though as a policy, we should not be using WDRs for recycled water because it's not a waste.
I think we are interested to have a conversation, more specific conversation with you on those projects to see if there is anything we can incorporate in the policy or is something that we need to address just specifically for the project. So that's an interesting topic. Thanks for bringing it up.
Hi, Sam from Regional SAN. We currently have a water reclamation permit with the regional board, and we have always made sure, our permit and our recycling water quality is in conformance with Title 22. So we want to work with Water Board, and I want to kind of caution the Water Board for with the language that's going to go in this policy that to make sure that the existing permits are not affected in any way, setting up a timeline for regional board to review that is appropriate as long as it doesn't have any impact on existing permits. Thank you.
So the way we're proposing to draft the language now would require the review and update if necessary. So that would fit in with what you're saying.
One thing I forgot to respond on the earlier comment was that the general order basically has a provision that if the applicant requests to be enrolled under the general order and they're eligible to be enrolled, then the regional board needs to make a finding if they do not want to enroll them under the general order. So that's why I was interested to have a more conversation about that specific project. So there is that provision in the statewide order.
I'm just wondering if there's a typo and that it should be Title 23, Chapter 22.
So we'll take a look at that. Yeah, it's California Code of Regulations, Title 22. There are other recycled water requirements in the California Code of Regulations. Pretty sure it's Title 22.
22. All right.
You had just spoke to it, but I just want to make sure I understand. When you say review and update, we currently have a master reclamation permit, which we really like. If the regional board decides to update that, would that be updated as a master reclamation permit? Can we still have that option to update it as that current permitting mechanism? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Backtracking to question for topic 6, have a question from Sean Windell of Fish and Wildlife Water Branch. Can you elaborate on how the State Water Board will consider potential cumulative impacts due to potential increases in wastewater change petitions?
So I would be interested in following up with Sean. We are still working on the draft language, so I can't tell you verbatim what it will be today, but I'd like to follow up with you, Sean, on that specific issue. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'd like to introduce this last topic that we'd like to bring up, and that is rescinding a 2009 general order for landscape irrigation. So the state adopted in 2009 a general order for landscape irrigation uses of recycled water, and that was in response to a requirement in the water code. At this time, there are 2 permittees enrolled in this irrigation order. So the proposed amendment may include a requirement to transition those enrollees into the 2016 WRRs, which are current and cover all non-potable uses of recycled water, and including landscape irrigation. So the proposal is to transition those enrollees to 2016 WRRs and to rescind the 2009 order. It's WQ 2009-0060 DWQ. So fairly short introduction there. Are there any comments or questions about that proposal? Yeah, except for the silent thumbs up.
The two permittees are Delta Diablo, who they share jurisdiction in regional, the Bay Area region and Central Valley, and then the other one is Calaveras County.
Any other comments or questions?
Sam Safi, Regional SAN. That's fine. You know, there's 2 permittees gonna get enrolled into. I'm sure they will provide some comment, but I kind of want to again echo what Elizabeth said and I said earlier. When we see something like that, you know, rescinding permits and getting enrolled, so it kind of worries us. We do like our reclamation permits, and that's why we kind of like insist on commenting that the previous topic should not impact. It's better for us working with our regional board on the requirement of our permit. So it's important that the language coming in this policy doesn't pave a way for any kind of this future rescindment of permits.
Thank you. Yeah.
And just to clarify, as Scott mentioned, we're talking about these in the abstract without a lot of the background discussion will be in the staff report. The landscape irrigation general permit kind of was required by statute, part of it to streamline the permitting of those type of projects and have a statewide approach. And the other thing that was unique about that was that it can be issued by state board. So I remember at the time I was in the funding program, so it allowed us to quickly permit a couple of projects which were multi-jurisdictional in order for them to be able to be eligible for the infrastructure funding that had a limited window to do it. So now that time has passed, the reason we're saying to rescind that, because we think the general order meets the same intent as Scott mentioned, and also the general order currently gives the state port authority to issue those permits for multi-jurisdictional areas. So basically meets the intent of it, and the requirements are more consistent with the policy. And in terms of implementation, obviously people are not excited to enroll under that general order. So that's and we wouldn't descend a specific order. This is a general order for use for the regional board. So when you're talking about a specific order for a facility that has been issued, that is the regional board's decision to go ahead do that in terms of deciding whether it's appropriate to keep them under the master reclamation permit, or maybe it's more streamlined that they enroll them under the ones. All we're asking them is to review the permits to make sure the requirements are consistent. Like if they have groundwater recharge projects, we want to make sure those projects have monitoring requirements consistent with the CCC monitoring requirements that's in the current policy or update of the policy.
Okay, well, that actually walks through the specific topics we wanted to cover. Like we mentioned earlier, we did set aside some time if other questions or comments might occur, even on something we covered. A hand up over there, so now's the time to bring those up.
Hi, Melissa Thorn. This wasn't exactly covered, but I know you had the topic to remove the stormwater goals, and that may be appropriate, but I wanted to maybe put an idea out there about reusing stormwater through treatment plants to then be able to recycle it, and that maybe we should be encouraging that, particularly for industrial stormwater, which tends to not be as much as municipal stormwater, that maybe there's a way that people could get a permit to where treatment plants have capacity in the sewers and the plant to be able to take that would be a good way to deal with industrial stormwater, particularly when the permits are getting more and more stringent over time. So, not necessarily a mandate or anything, but a consideration that if you have capacity, that might be a good project to either take in municipal stormwater or industrial stormwater, then it could be an additional source of recycled water.
So let me understand the comment. When we're referring the source of recycled water being municipal, we're talking about the output of the municipal wastewater facility. So if it's going through the treatment, is that what you're talking about? If they're accepting it and blending it with their wastewater and they're treating it, then the treated wastewater and recycled water from that would be considered recycled water that's coming from municipal treatment source. Yeah.
But the thought was you could increase, we're getting the flows to a lot of the treatment plants going down because of conservation. So the amount of water that you have to recycle is going down. So this would be an additional source of water to the treatment plant that then could be recycled.
Yeah, which we totally agree. Yeah.
So sorry, just one more follow-up with that. You're proposing to that we keep those goals or include some kind of narrative description of how to.
So I don't know what those said, so I can't say whether they should be kept or not. But the thought is to have an encouragement where you have the ability. There's some treatment plants that are near capacity that can't take on anymore, that have really high I&I issues. But there are treatment plants that have capacity that it would make sense to have these kind of diversion projects.
Yeah, so when we say remove the goals for conservation and stormwater, I think you're making a good point. The reason we're suggesting, as Bobby observed earlier, there's other forums to come up with that goals. We have conservation regs, we have a stormwater strategy, and they're looking at stormwater capture and use. But it is appropriate, based on the feedback, to recognize the value of stormwater and just not say we're taking it. I think there would be some discussion either in the staff report, the value of both conservation as well as stormwater in terms of enhancing our ability to deal with drought and water supply issues.
Okay. So, did you want to say?
Thank you, Debbie Webster again. I just again want to appreciate you guys having these listening sessions. But as we were talking about the various subjects today, there was quite a bit of them that I kept on thinking what a benefit it has been to have whether it's regional board or state board staff, work with a group of stakeholders in a smaller forum, not necessarily in these open sessions, to work on different issues. And if it's related to things like how to categorize and track recycled water and how to do that meaningfully, because you're going to get a different answer if, and excuse me for using City of San Diego, which is really huge, versus using Calaveras County, because I doubt that Calaveras County's meter even starts getting to where they wouldn't even count that, and that might be a huge volume for Calaveras County. So getting that kind of meaningful results and really understanding what you're looking for and what you can get from the stakeholders, I think is a really helpful process. So I'd really encourage that. As we were talking about in the beginning, or you were talking about salt sinks, the Central Valley, again, is a little bit different in that we don't have an ocean outfall, and we are really looking towards developing salt sinks, because when we look towards using reverse osmosis, we don't want to be doing it at water that is just a little bit above an objective. We want to be doing it with really salty water. And we're trying to figure out how to get those best uses of water, which means that, hey, on first recycled water use, we might be a little bit saltier, but there may be 3 or 4 that is over a drinking water objective or something like that before we really want to take that and then use reverse osmosis or clean it up. And so those are some things to consider as we're looking at it. And the other part that we were talking about earlier, and I was thinking about, was as we look at recycled water and the different balances and the climate change being another area or discussion area, there's times where recycled water mandates may make sense because you do have climate impacts. And I really appreciate, again, what San Diego was talking about with all their work with looking at doing low impact changes. But sometimes in the Central Valley, to recycle, we're actually using a whole bunch more energy than we would if we would just have it go into the groundwater, because we're not doing the importing. We're adding a carbon footprint. So as we're looking at those things, those are all different balances and considerations that go into recycled water. And as we're talking about mandates, I really do agree with the instead of trying to reach a number goal, is to looking at what is the best way to use water, the one water concept. And if we can continue to try to integrate that and realize just what a resource that it is, but that we're trying to balance all of our resources, including our financial resources, that would be important. So thank you.
Additional comments or questions here in the room? Any folks online?
Still a question. So there's an opportunity to make comments today, and I guess around the January 11th workshop, and then after that?
So that's actually a good segue. I'm going to talk about that again at the end, but we'll be releasing the draft policy amendment for a 45-day public comment period in late March or early April, and we'll be accepting written comments during that time. Got a comment there in the back.
So the Science Advisory Panel evaluated impacts to human health, but they didn't evaluate impacts to fish, wildlife, and plant life. So do you have a strategy for that?
I got it. So Claire Wagner, State Water Board. We deliberately focused the panel on recycled water projects just so we could meet the deadline for this policy. But the water boards does have a broader CEC program that would include looking at impacts or monitoring recommendations for impacts to wildlife. So the panel was convened in 2009 to look at that. They released a report, I think it was in 2012, for ambient monitoring recommendations. Some of the regional boards have taken those and run with it and implemented those and are generating data now. Last February, we did an information item for our board that sort of synthesized what's going on throughout the regions. And as a program, we're trying to build capacity to better respond to CECs. And so we're in really the nascent stages of building that program, but we have a staff person dedicated to it now, which is half the battle. And so I think in the next couple months to years, we're going to make more progress on building that program better, but we're having conversations already about convening the panel again to look at the recommendations for ambient monitoring as it stands today. But I think programmatically what we want to do before we get the panel back together is do a state of the science for what do we know now, so that we can get them the information they need to make recommendations.
Any additional comments?
My comments are for Friends of the North Fork only. I hope you're talking about a different composition of the panel, because it's very narrowly focused in terms of other environmental issues. I think you should consider maybe building the staff knowledge to deal with this and not rely on the Southern California Water Research outfit, as we've said in other comments. But there's maybe one person who describes some epidemiological background, but there's no ecological or biological or the variety of other expertise. To go back to that same body.
Just a comment on that. I would disagree, because we have Dr. Nancy Denslow, who looks at impacts to wildlife, as does Dan Schlenk at UC Riverside. So I would encourage you to explore the panel's CVs, and they're posted online, but I would disagree that none of them have the ecological component.
Well, I guess the proof will be in the pudding about what they come out with in their recommendations, because I've read their bios, and I don't see the necessary science there. And I think we probably should try to make some suggestions about what you need for what's basically a chemistry panel. So I call attention to the absence of public involvement in this process. If one would walk in and think it's not controversial, the public's not here, environmental groups, with an exception or two or three, are not here. The Southern California Water Research use of a particular group, that group doesn't represent Friends of Norfolk in any way, shape, or form and they excluded us from their process back in 2009, the self-identified stakeholder process. So the board, if on any issue they're going to start having meaningful public involvement, I noticed there was, as appropriate, a press release on an agricultural issue. I didn't see press releases on this kind of thing. I just don't see the public outreach and the information the public needs to be getting. There is a concern about if I have not been involved in the Central Valley salt and nutrient issue that's, I think, set for hearing before the Central Valley Board. But I did glance at it. It looks like a 50-year program potentially to deal with the centuries-old issue. There is a concern about that. The focus on salts and nutrients is important and critical. I'm glad to see it in there. It's the dominant concern listed amongst your concerns, but there are other major concerns that deserve equal attention in the policy. That one is singled out and put in the policy calls attention to all these other issues that are not being addressed on a policy basis. A good example would be the problem of that's been identified in some foreign policy publications in the last several years of pandemics coming from wildlife, avian, other exposure to antibiotic or other products of the water treatment and recycling process. Friends would be concerned about sewer plant waters or groundwater recharge basins, the variety of places where there might be added elements from the source water that could get into the avian population and spread into other issues and become a problem. And we did recently identify some articles on the subject we'll be submitting. The assimilative capacity issue is important to address in the way has been proposed, but it also brings to mind other assimilative capacity issues that, of course, should be addressed in the CEQA process, but whether it's mixing zones or so forth, and how that would be affected by recycling. I guess it wouldn't be a bad idea to come up with a list of other issues that really need attention that in the process. But want to thank you for this opportunity. These workshops were an excellent opportunity, and the CEQA, getting CEQA early scoping is terrific, of terrific value. I think I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for your comments. And as Laura mentioned, we had started with small listening sessions, and we did talk to some of the folks from the North Coast. We have these workshops. We had CEQA scoping meetings. We have additional meeting, and then when the policy is released as a draft, then there will be opportunity for comment. But by all means, to the extent we can accommodate the timing, if you want to kind of come sit down, talk to us, and kind of go through those issues, we'd be more than happy to have that conversation, because we have various tools and processes that we can deal with certain issues. And recycled water policy is an important document, but it's not solution to all the issues we have. And you're bringing up some good points that need to be addressed, or your comment about staff resources. I would love to build the staff resources and expertise within my program to do all the CECs, but the reality is that, well, we have limitations in terms of our budget, and a number of staff can work on this. So over time, we have found working with universities and expert panels to kind of help augment our determination, and we have scientists that look at that information critically. If needed, we do peer reviews. So we would love to chat with you and your colleagues on a more specific issues and kind of identify what are some of the other forums that we can continue working, addressing some issues. Because ultimately, the goal of the policy is to promote recycled water, also make sure that's used in a way that's protective of public health and water quality. And the worst thing you can do to water recycling is if you actually create a problem that then people are concerned to use it. So we all have the same goal. It's just a matter of which issues we can address and focus for the policy, and which ones we can look at on a research side, and which ones we can look on the kind of other policies or other programs, you know, that we have within the water board that may be more appropriate to tackle those issues. So thanks again on my behalf. I really appreciate it. We had a small group, but we had a group that was engaged, and we had great comments, great feedback. I look forward later on having conversations with you. And again, I'd like to also thank staff for doing such a great job. So.
All right, so we showed the full project schedule earlier, but I want to reiterate we have another public stakeholder meeting next week on January 11th in Fountain Valley, where we'll be discussing the same topics that we covered today. So there's no need to attend both if you are down south. Then the Science Advisory Panel will be releasing their draft report for a 30-day public comment period in mid-January. So we will be posting that on our website and also sending emails out on that. They'll finalize their report in mid to late February, and then we'll be taking their recommendations and looking at them for the draft amendment that we plan to release in late March or early April for a 45-day public comment period. So there's plenty of opportunity in there for written public comments. I would also encourage you to contact me directly if you have any additional thoughts or concerns that you think of prior to that public release in late March. The sooner the better. We can take those considerations into account. Also, if you're not signed up for our email listserv, that is the best way to stay up to date on what's going on. There's a lot of moving pieces. So the way to sign up for that is going to the Recycled Water Policy webpage, and then at the top right, there's a link you can click on to specifically sign up for our email listserv. And if you're having trouble finding it, feel free to give me a call or send me an email, laura.mcclellan@waterboards.ca.gov. Thank you. Yes, meeting adjourned.